Thank you for being here today, everyone. Welcome back to Visions for the Future of Higher Ed. Today we have David Burns with us, the Associate Vice President Academic at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, KPU. Thank you for being here, David. I had a chance to watch a presentation by David at the AI Academy event in Calgary a few months ago, put on by the incredible HESA team, and really enjoyed hearing your perspectives on the future of higher ed, David. So thank you for being here today to continue that conversation and share some of what you have in mind for the future of higher ed, some of your visions. And the first kind of question I always like to ask when I get the chance to interview folks like yourself is really what got you started in higher ed? What's the story? I know you've been at Kwantlen for a little while now and have probably seen a lot of change, but where did the journey start for you?
I started out being a high school teacher because teaching is one of the most fun and rewarding things that you can do in life, I think. And when I started to look at where I wanted to go over the course of my career, I realized that some of the problems and the challenges that I thought we could really face and run at were policy problems. And so I ended up studying education policy in my master's and PhD. And as I went through that, I learned that in addition to having a lot of fun teaching and interacting with students, I also like to create ideas and follow ideas through as far as I could follow them. And I had a really great graduate experience for that. And so, what do you do if you're going to be teaching, but also creating a lot of novel ideas if you can? Well, that ends up being in higher education. So, it ended up doing the two things that I really wanted to do with my time.
That's incredible. I love hearing when people come from a teaching background and now are in this position to help kind of inform policy and, bring some of those ideas to life. So that's amazing to hear. And the next question I've been wanting to ask people as I've been having more and more of these conversations is about what is giving you hope in higher ed right now. There have been so many conversations about the challenges being faced across the board, and those are well known. And there are some incredible leaders I know guiding institutions across Canada through this tricky time. But what kind of things are giving you hope right now? Are there things you're seeing, programs, technologies, people that are giving you hope in the future of
Hmm.
higher ed?
Well, I think the incentive structure in the sector today has some features and challenges that are obviously well covered and they're really hard and there's a lot of really challenging conversations going on, but they also encourage us to refocus on certain things in a way that I actually have a lot of hope about within all this challenge that we're having. So in the previous era, right up until all these international student changes, whether you intended to do it that way or not, there was a really strong incentive to do a lot of international recruitment, a lot of things that catered to international students, and worry less about the way in which the domestic student population was changing over time. Like you always offer quality programs, but it wasn't a top priority to say, okay, why is there a change in this part of the population? Why are there different needs here than they were over there? Because just naturally, at the end of the day, that's not how the overall picture of how the sector is funded was working at the time, right?
True.
And I never met anyone who said we should defocus on one group of students and focus on another. But you can see at a system level how that's kind of how the incentive structure played out. And since that's changed now, institutions have this incredibly powerful reason to go back to the structure of the education we offer to domestic students and say, how is it that we can really reinvest our attention in the way in which these programs meet the needs of these learners and mature learners over time once they leave that first degree that they're taking? And so the area of real hope that I'm seeing, that I'm just personally thrilled about, is that the focus is shifting a lot more to mature learners than it used to be. Because mature learners are harder to find and they're harder to serve than new domestic students that are coming out of high school and then new international students coming out of high school. And so it's been natural, I think, that people haven't paid as much attention to that. And of course, some people have the whole time, but just not as a sector. But the focus on prior learning and mature learners is, I think, much stronger today. And we've got really good reasons to invest in that and focus on that. And there's a really romantic vision and mission there working with mature learners because it requires you to confront the question of how much we value what people bring to the university, right? What they're bringing in from other places, what they've learned in the field, what they've learned in, for example, their home countries or the disciplines or the industries that they work in, and how we can have a dialogue between the things that we teach here and the things that they bring to us and can teach us while they're here. And that's really what prior learning is about. And that's, I think, what mature learners need. And I think I'm seeing in the sector, there's a lot more conversation now about investing in and focusing on those kinds of things. That's really exciting. In terms of technology, there's obviously a lot of conversation about these kind of the AI will change everything questions, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit about that later. But some of the ways in which AI is doing much subtler work or things that aren't in the news all the time are perhaps the most exciting. One of them is with accessibility technology. So, over the last couple of generations, universities have started to become small welfare systems unto themselves. They actually offer lots and lots of social services, really importantly, because students have particular needs. Universities and colleges are communities where students spend their time, in many cases live. And so there's this need to have a government and social system within the institutions. The problem with that is that it's really hard for a university to do as good a job at healthcare as a health system, as good a job at counseling as a counseling clinic, and so forth, right? Like these are things we have to create in microcosm, and that's always hard.
Yes.
One of those areas is with accessibility. So if we have a moral and legal obligation, which we do, to ensure the university is accessible to all, that means we have to create all these kind of very specific, often bespoke accessibility supports for things like braille printing or sign language interpretation. And that's a really important mission, right? In a free society committed to justice, you want to do everything you can. The challenge with that is that every one of those is a really small population. And so it's hard for an institution to make the kind of investments you need to meet your obligations and your duties, right? But with accessibility technology, you can have smartphones that do quite a lot of that kind of interpretation now. And with visual processing, you can have your smartphone explain what it's looking at in a way that wasn't possible before. So it would not surprise me that in 5 or 10 years, the quality of accessibility support at university might be actually tremendously different than it is today. Not because the system itself is flipped upside down, but because the tools are cheaper and more powerful than they were just a few years ago. And that's pretty darn cool. The kind of every single person needs to be welcome mission that we all talk a lot about, but we don't manifest to the extent that we might. That could actually be more attainable than it used to be.
Those are two really interesting areas to align that hope with, David, because I
Mm.
think, like you're saying, a lot of people think of AI in a similar way, but that type of technology is definitely becoming more and more accessible itself. The form factors of, being able to do this on your phone or with smaller and smaller headsets is becoming more and more affordable. I think that's a really cool technology to keep an eye on, especially for a purpose like that. Because one thing I've come to learn about accessibility is that by serving these small groups of people, we actually end up being able to make things easier for the larger population as well. So I think that those kind of tools will certainly um, be exciting to bring everyone into these different types of services the universities and colleges offer, and have this traditional ripple effect into the rest of the student body as well that brings them along too in a way that might not be expected. I think that's a really interesting set of technologies to keep an eye on. But the mature student focus, I think, is really interesting too, because I think now is a challenging time, not only in higher ed, but across many sectors and industries. And so I think people are thinking about, what's next for them, and whether that's spurred by the challenges of the time or just people wanting to try different things at different points in their lives. I think it's going to be exciting that universities are reaching out to mature learners and mid-career professionals to provide that same type of learning opportunity that you hear about after high school. So I think that's a great one too.
Yeah, I mean, the question of how we recognize professional licenses people have has been an
Yeah.
interesting one. So, a
Oh,
professional
yeah.
license ultimately, of course, is a credential, but institutions don't normally recognize it as a credential. And so I've got a really small unit that's kind of an innovative startup within my office that works with some of these flexible learning and mature learners kind of questions. And one of the things we were doing was working with our faculty of health because we're launching the country's first public traditional Chinese medicine bachelor's program, which is one of just the coolest things. I mean, I go to the clinic actually for acupuncture just to see how it works and things like that. It's just wonderful. It's one of those things I could talk about all day. But within it, the way that you become a Chinese medicine practitioner is it's a combination of acupuncture and herbalism. Essentially, there's kind of two parent disciplines that go into that. We have had acupuncture for a long time. There's lots of registered acupuncturists in British Columbia, but they need to come back and do the herbology or the herbal studies in order to become Chinese medicine practitioners. So we've got this really interesting question. We've got these people with enormous expertise that have been practicing out in the field for years. And then the normal system would be, no, you got to come back and take both of those things and all of both of those things. But we're
Ah,
working now to get that license to count for the acupuncture component. And as this program launches in the next year, that's exactly the kind of thing we're looking at, because obviously that is not just meaningful expertise, but it's verified and certified expertise. So those are the kind of things where there's some pretty low hanging fruit that to
yeah.
somebody outside the university, you would be like, seriously, you think that's an achievement that you're doing that? Really? But within the institution and all of its complexity, that actually is a change in a lot of these cases that doesn't cost us much, but makes a big difference in how people feel about what they bring to university and how the university sees it.
Yeah, that is so interesting, and it's, I appreciate how self-aware, you are when you talk about it because it is one of those funny things you would think that, "Oh, of course," but like you're saying, that's since it's not the case, moving in that direction, I think is gonna get a ton of people excited, um, and get them more interested in going through these programs or upskilling themselves, so that's a really cool one, and awesome that you get a chance to actually try the fruits of that labor at the
Yeah,
get to go
it's
down
at
and
our
actually
Richmond
try it.
campus.
Yeah.
Beautiful neighborhood, actually. Go hard promo here. But there's some wonderful restaurants around that campus too. So you can go for some acupuncture, go get some pho across the street. It's one of my favorite reasons to visit that area because we've got several campuses. The Richmond campus got lots of neat things there, but going for some acupuncture and some of the food on that street's a very good reason.
But yeah, that's a great reason to head out there, no question. If you're in the area, folks, that's a place to check out for sure. And are there opportunities for people to come and try student,
Yeah.
services and things like that?
Yeah. Yeah,
Oh,
there's
nice.
actually if you go to a clinic for like massage or physio, the same kind of
Yeah.
booking software, they've got it over at the student clinic for that. Yeah.
Well, that's always worth keeping an eye out for. Very, very cool to hear.
Yeah, the students are
Um,
fantastic. Like you go in
yeah.
there and there's a group of them that work with you and they're getting consulted. They're consulting rather with their instructor. And so you can hear the kind of, all right, how do we do it like this? And what is this sort of thing over here? Oh, do you remember from that? This guy has this kind of problem from that course you took 2 semesters ago. You remember that? This is why we talked about that. But it's fun. In education, you don't get to see the whole kind of the full stack of progression in the same way. And that's always really interesting.
It is to actually get to try what the students are learning and see it applied. That's really cool. And that's an awesome story. I was going to ask actually as one of the questions I was hoping to hear from you on is, are there stories that remind you why this work matters, whether it's, a specific student that's come through the program or a
Mm.
program itself that has kind of evolved in your time at KPU? Are there any other stories that come to
Mm.
mind that remind you, this is why higher education matters?
Mm. Oh, well, I'm kind of a romantic on most of these things, so you might
Okay.
get some cringy reactions to the way I talk about the mission because I'm one of those people who deeply believes in those idealistic purposes and drives.
I think we need more of that. So please go ahead.
Well, I've got a couple. I went to do an oil change actually, and we at the time had a parking pass that said KPU. So I was in line for this change, and a young man comes out, really young man. And he comes over and says, "Oh, you're from KPU." As I'm waiting for my turn up in the line, I said, "Yeah, yeah, I am." And he's like, "Oh, yeah, I studied business there. Is so and so still teaching?" First of all, that's a great indication there that they remember a person. That's always really powerful. And I said, "Oh, they just retired actually, but I know who you're talking about. Great guy." And I said, "So are you the manager of this place? What's going on?" I said, "Oh, no, no, no. I took out a loan and I opened two of them after I graduated." And they're doing really well. That's incredible. Like you go to
That's
business school and
amazing.
that's the kind of roll up your sleeves, changing, like you've changed the trajectory potentially of your family with that kind of work and innovation and entrepreneurship, right? That makes big changes. Another one that I absolutely adored is I came to KPU to teach initially because I was thinking about whether to go somewhere else and so on because I thought that you could really author your own work here as a faculty member. You didn't have to publish at this just constant cadence that you have to at some places. You could really pick your projects in a way that I really appreciated. And so I just made up essentially a research team at the university to work on education policy. And it allowed me, to apply for some funding here and there and train some students in the kind of policy analysis that I personally enjoy. And two of the people of that small group of people I worked with ended up doing policy work with one with the provincial government, one with the federal government. at times when the policy areas they were working in were hugely important, things like emergency preparedness during COVID. And so to see that kind of a line between a really applied kind of education where you're rolling up your sleeves and you're going policy by policy sometimes, and then see them go out and just hit it out of the park and end up doing something that matters to that degree. It's just, you could talk about that all day long. And I'm turning into one of those older guys who loves it when people call back and say, "Remember when I was in your class?" But it's
It's
absolutely terrific.
oh, it is, and that it's like you said, right? It's just a it's an incredible feeling that students remember and want to share those stories back with the people who were part of the journey. So I'm so glad you've had a couple recent experiences of that. I had a student reach out recently as well. They went through an interview. I think after spending this was a mature student actually. To your earlier point, they had spent 10 years working on a farm, and so they had never
Mm.
been to a job interview before. But they had a complete change in the career they wanted. They wanted to become a 911 call taker,
Mm.
and they said there were 1,000 applicants for the job. And of course, as you know, we do a little bit of work on on some AI technology. They ended up practicing with what we had, and they got the job. But that was about a year ago, and about a month ago, they messaged me and said that they just helped deliver their first baby. And I had I think a small moment like what you're saying, where
That's awesome.
I was like, wow, yeah, that's just life changing. That's incredible to hear. So, I know what you mean, and it's always nice to hear from those students who will tell you, hey, they've used what they learned. That's incredible, David. I know I only have you for a few more minutes here, so maybe the last kind of question I'll ask you here is, um, you know, what's is there something bold happening right now in higher ed that you've heard of or that you're working on that you're excited to kind of see progress over the next few years? I know you've mentioned a little bit about this shift in student focus, but are there any other kind of bold changes that you've heard about or that you're interested in exploring over the next few years?
Well, we're having lots of good and interesting conversations about credentials, certification, and skills, right? And competency-based education was something I spent a lot of time working on in my own research and writing and things like that around portfolios and how we prove that we can do and that we know the things that we do and know. And so as we shift into an era where it's pretty clear that lifelong learning and coming back to school is becoming increasingly important, and that other forms of self or autodidactic training are really important. As we shift into that, we're having lots of really good conversations about what a credential is. And I think one of the most fruitful areas of that is that we're spending more time talking to students about what they've already learned, which is something we've traditionally been really poor at, because we tend to tell them the point of the course is your grade, the point of the grades is your GPA, the point of your GPA is to make an argument to an employer that you're worth hiring. And the byproduct of that shift is that you bury all of the actual achievement of evidence behind layers and layers and layers of increasingly general measurement. And so by the end of it, when you say my GPA is 3.9, there's absolutely no precise achievement represented there. It's a broad, it's almost like a vibe of achievement,
Yeah,
3.9, right? You
that's the
can't
way to
say,
put it.
I have a 3.9, and so this happened, or I did this, or I created that. It's just, I have a 3.9. That's a very convenient way to describe achievement because it's quick, it's two digits and a decimal point in the middle, and it's pretty universal, right? You can go to different provinces in a lot of different countries. As long as you say what the scale is, people will understand you. But it also doesn't tell anyone something about whether you can code that particular kind of function in an app, or whether you can write a policy for a particular purpose, or whether you can speak a certain language. It speaks way more generally than that. And the joke I always have is that a 3.9 could tell you that someone got an A plus on the lab worksheets and an F minus in the lab because they burnt the school down. And those will average out depending on the way that the assignments are graded to a pretty good mark, because lab safety is only ever like a few points within a course. So the 3.9 is ambiguous on the question of whether you burnt down the lab or not, whereas the conversations we're starting to have about competency and portfolio, those tell you a lot more potentially if you can find a shared way of communicating.
That is really exciting to hear. I think that's going to change the way a lot of students think about school, and that is a bold change. I know that's going to be an interesting one and one that takes people a second to process that, there there might be a way to show what students are capable of that isn't grades, or is in step or supplements grades. But that is a really interesting point. I'm going to be thinking about that over the weekend here, David. What's a way to unify that?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I laugh the most about is when I think about these things in the context of my own career.
Right.
And so you think about how academic leadership jobs work. You're qualified for them because you're an academic, not because you've managed anything typically.
Okay.
So when you go from being a faculty member to a chair, or a faculty member to an associate dean, or a faculty member to a dean, or a faculty member to an associate vice president, you're doing that because you've done some work coordinating some things, but you're typically not someone who's experienced in managing things like budgets or HR or strategic plans, right? And
Fair.
I'll always joke when people ask me, like, how did you get the job you're in? I was like, I have absolutely no idea. I spent 10 years writing obscure periodicals that were read by maybe 4 or 5 people in the aggregate. And then all of a sudden woke up one day and I was this co-manager of a very large enterprise that spent all kinds of money and had all these responsibilities.
Hmm.
And if you look at the way we hire, you put up a job description for one like mine, it's got all these outcomes, essentially, the requirements of the job, the things you need to do. And when they ask me what my qualification is, I will say, I have a PhD. And in the academy, that okay, may ask you some follow-up questions and things. It would be much more productive to say, all right, for these particular performances, what skill development evidence can you provide? And they would have found out in that moment, if that had been done with me, that I had almost no financial literacy beyond I used to pay my credit card bill before my spouse said, you better let me do that, right? So within that kind of an environment, you can imagine how an employer would say, okay, that's great, David, but did you burn down the lab,
Yes. Fair
right?
question.
And so going into those and having a much more precise way for institutions to communicate what the PhD meant, what the bachelor's degree meant, what the master's meant, what the micro-credential meant, is not only good in the sense that people are better off if they know more about the structure of what they've learned, but also in the sense that that education will have more value to people because it's less ambiguous in its objectives.
Yeah, that's hard to argue with, and I think makes a ton of sense. And again, I appreciate the way you've told the story there, David, like from personal experience, and of course now in this role, I know you're doing incredible work. But it's interesting to think how you might have framed, your own experience differently if that had been how you were being evaluated. And yeah, I think that's going to be very, very interesting. I'm hearing more about that too. Micro credentials, competency based outcomes, and different ways to showcase these
Mm.
skills that students have. So that is a thought provoking one. I'm really glad you made time for this. I think a lot of people are going to enjoy hearing some of these thoughts and will be scratching their heads in a good way, thinking, yeah, how could that work? So I know I got to let you go, but maybe we'll reach back out and try to have you back on in the future and see if we can, continue some of this brainstorming with you.
Yeah, if you want me to detail any other of my incompetencies at some future state, I'd be happy to call back and go through how much I have to learn still. It's a
I,
pleasure.
I think that's it's one of the things I admire most in leadership, David. So I appreciate the honesty and the chance to learn from you and your experiences. I truly appreciate that. So thank you very much for making some time today, and I hope they get a chance to do this again soon. Awesome. Thank you, David.